It was the last night of 1997, and Marvin Rogers was standing on a Miami street with his cell phone pressed to his ear, leaning against his car. He was not someone who was careless as a rule. Men in his position, enforcers for one of the most violent gangs in Miami's history, active participants in a war that had been consuming the city's poorest neighborhoods for 5 straight years. On that night, leaning against his car on New Year's Eve with his phone to his ear and the end of the year pressing in around him, he made the one mistake that his entire history of careful movement had been designed to prevent. He stopped paying attention. Robert Lee Sawyer, the man the street called Rah Rah, and who served as the primary enforcer for the Vonda gang, was riding with 2 associates. Jamal Brown, known as Pukalota, was behind the wheel, and Andre McWhorter, called Bam, was in the car as well. Rah Rah and Rogers had been trying to kill each other for years. The cat and mouse had gone on so long, and through so many near misses that it had begun to feel like a permanent condition of both their lives. Rogers had shot at Rah Rah from moving vehicles. He had ambushed him on residential streets. He had tracked him to a hospital after wounding him on I-95 in September 1997 and discussed finishing the job in an elevator, believing no one was listening. None of it had worked. Now on New Year's Eve, the equation had reversed. The moment Rah Rah saw Rogers standing there unaware, the decision took no deliberation. The car stopped. Both men stepped out. McWhorter fired his pistol first, striking Rogers in the back of the leg. As Rogers went down, Rah Rah moved in with an AK-47 and fired it into Rogers' face and chest at close range. When Miami police arrived and processed the scene, the photographs were, in the words of retired Metro Dade detective Tony Monheim, gruesome. Marvin Rogers, one of the Booby Boys' most capable and feared members, had been removed from the war permanently, and the method of his removal was designed to be unambiguous. The investigation moved to phone records within hours. What they revealed was a direct call from Rah Rah to Avonda Dowling placed immediately after he left the scene. Avonda Dowling, the woman the entire city called Blackgirl, the woman who ran the Vonda gang out of Overtown, who had been at war with the Booby Boys since 1993 and who had been operating a continuous drug distribution operation in the same Miami neighborhood since 1985. She paid Rah Rah $12,000 in cash and 1.5 kilograms of cocaine for the killing of Marvin Rogers. That was the rate. It was not a negotiated figure. It reflected an established compensation structure for contract violence within the organization, a structure that had been in place long enough to have its own internal consistency. Rah Rah then drove north to Tallahassee. He was not panicking. He was executing the protocol. The following morning, less than 18 hours after Rogers died on that Miami street, the Booby Boys found Pukalota standing outside his duplex and shot him in the neck. The bullet severed his spinal cord. He was paralyzed from that point forward, confined to a wheelchair for the rest of his life. In under 24 hours, the gang war had claimed one life, destroyed another, and set in motion a chain of events that would end with federal indictments, 6-week trials, and prison sentences that would define the remainder of the lives of almost everyone involved in what happened on New Year's Eve, 1997. But the killing of Marvin Rogers was not the beginning of the story. It was one consequence among many produced by an organization that had been building, expanding, and defending itself through violence for more than a decade before that night. To understand why Avonda Dowling was paying for murders on New Year's Eve 1997, and why she had been in a position to pay for them at all, the story has to start with the city that made her possible and the neighborhood inside that city that shaped her into someone who could operate the way she did for as long as she did. Miami in the early 1980s was absorbing cocaine at a scale that had no equivalent in American history. The product moved through South Florida in volumes that restructured the street economy almost overnight, creating access to wealth in the informal market that legitimate employment could not remotely approach. Every major corridor into the city was being used for distribution. Every neighborhood with enough population density was being identified as a potential market. The men building organizations around the cocaine trade during this period were operating in an environment of almost complete impunity. Law enforcement was stretched, federal resources were only beginning to be allocated to the problem, and the violence required to protect territory was so normalized within the trade that it barely registered as exceptional. The geography of that trade within Miami was not evenly distributed. The heaviest concentration of both drug activity and drug-related violence was located in the city's poorest neighborhoods, areas already carrying the structural weight of decades of disinvestment, where the informal economy had expanded to fill the vacancy that legitimate economic opportunity had left behind, and where the entry barriers to the drug trade were lowest because the alternatives were fewest. Overtown was one of those neighborhoods. It was where the cocaine economy of 1980s Miami was most visibly concentrated, most deeply embedded in the daily fabric of community life, and most resistant to disruption. Because disrupting the trade in Overtown meant disrupting an economy that a significant portion of the neighborhood's residents had come to depend on in one form or another, whether as participants, adjacent businesses, or simply people trying to navigate the reality of what their neighborhood had become. In that environment, certain people built things that lasted. Most of them were men. The expectation that a woman could build something at that level and maintain it through violence, competition, and sustained law enforcement attention for 15 years was not an expectation that Miami held in 1983. It was a fact that Miami could not deny by 1998. The investigators who spent years trying to understand the violence in the city's poorest neighborhoods did not expect the answer to point where it pointed. They were looking for the next Booby Williams. What they found at the center of everything was someone who had been operating in plain sight since 1985, someone whose organization had outlasted rivals, absorbed gang war, and continued functioning through arrests, shootings, and federal scrutiny in ways that required a level of institutional discipline that most of the male-dominated organizations in Miami's drug trade had never achieved. And when Metro-Dade investigators began pulling informants and asking them about the violence at the center of the city, asking them whether they would work for Avonda Dowling, the answer was universal and immediate. No, she was too dangerous. Retired Detective Jeff Lewis, who spent years building cases against the Booby Boys before turning his full attention to Avonda, arrived at a conclusion he stated without equivocation. She was worse than Booby. This is how that became true. Overtown, and the woman it produced Overtown, was not the neighborhood that the rest of Miami thought it was. The public image, shaped by decades of disinvestment, news coverage of the drug trade, and the physical desolation visible from the I-95 overpass, obscured a history that was more complex, and a community that had, for the first half of the 20th century, built something genuinely durable under conditions designed to prevent it. The neighborhood was originally called Colored Town, a name imposed by the legal segregation that defined its geographic and economic boundaries from outside. It ran along Northwest 8th to 20th Streets, bounded by I-95 and the Dolphin Expressway to the northeast and the Miami River to the southwest. Within those boundaries, the exclusion that kept Black Miamians out of the rest of the city had the unintended consequence of concentrating their economic activity internally. Black-owned businesses, hotels, theaters, and restaurants built a commercial district that, through the 1940s and into the 1950s, was among the most active in Miami. Nationally recognized performers who could not stay in segregated Miami Beach hotels would play shows there. The neighborhood had a nightlife and a civic culture that reflected what a community can produce when it has no alternative but to build for itself. The construction of Interstate 95 ended that. The highway was routed in the 1960s directly through the center of the neighborhood, requiring the displacement of tens of thousands of residents and the closure of businesses whose customer base had been physically removed. That routing decision followed a pattern repeated in city after city during the post-war infrastructure boom. Highways placed where land was cheap and political resistance was weakest, which consistently meant Black neighborhoods whose residents had no meaningful access to the planning processes that determined their fate. In Overtown, the result was immediate and lasting. The commercial district that had taken decades to build was destroyed in years. Property values collapsed. Population scattered. The institutions that had knit the community together lost the population density that had made them viable and close. By the time Avonda Dowling was growing up in Overtown in the late 1960s and 1970s, the neighborhood was living inside the long aftermath of that demolition. The poverty was structural, produced by deliberate policy and compounded by the absence of any compensating investment that might have rebuilt what the highway destroyed. The formal economy in Overtown offered limited options. The informal economy had expanded steadily to fill the gap, and by the 1980s it was expanding rapidly as the cocaine trade began generating the kind of money that no other available market could approach. Avonda was born in 1963, the daughter of James Dowling, known on the street and in his union as Big Jake, who held a senior position in the International Longshoremen's Union in Miami. That background placed her household at a specific remove from the deepest poverty in Overtown, not comfortable by any external standard, but grounded in the structure of organized labor, with its emphasis on collective action, defined hierarchy, and the relationship between loyalty and material reward. The Longshoremen's Union was, by the early 1960s, one of the few institutions that provided black working men in Miami a degree of economic stability and institutional standing that the broader labor market withheld. Big Jake's position within it meant that Avonda grew up in a household where the exercise of authority, the management of a workforce, and the enforcement of rules that kept an organization functioning were not abstract concepts. They were daily realities that she observed and absorbed from childhood. What that background gave her specifically was a template for how organizations worked, how power was distributed within a hierarchy, what loyalty was worth and what defection cost, and how the capacity to enforce the rules of a structure was the basis of whatever authority that structure possessed. None of those concepts translated directly into the drug trade, but the underlying logic did. And when Avonda later built an organization of her own, she built it with an internal consistency that reflected someone who had grown up watching structured institutions operate rather than someone improvising their way into management from scratch. Law enforcement officials who spent years investigating Avonda described her with a consistency that was notable given how long many of them had spent trying to build a case against her. She was tall, slender, and athletic. She was bisexual, with both male and female companions, which gave her access to social circles that would have been otherwise closed, and a mobility across different communities that most of her contemporaries in the drug trade did not have. She was also, by multiple independent accounts, unusually intelligent, capable of reading a situation, identifying its critical variables, and making decisions that reflected a genuine understanding of cause and effect rather than simple reaction. Tony Mannheim, the retired Metro-Dade detective who spent considerable time investigating the Vonda gang, described her in terms that were direct. She had an aura. People either respected her or feared her. Either way, the outcome was the same. She was effective. After graduating from Miami Carroll City High School, her movement toward the street economy was not immediate, but was consistent and logical given the environment she was in. Her earliest documented offenses were retail thefts, taking high-value merchandise from stores and running. They were small, opportunistic, and they mattered less for their financial return than for what they established about her behavioral pattern. She took risks without hesitation, and she did not back down from the consequences when they arrived. Beginning in March 1987, she faced multiple arrests for aggravated battery. The most illustrative incident on record occurred at 1140 Northwest 2nd Avenue, where she beat a victim with a bat, drove away from the scene, then turned around and came back to continue beating the same victim. That deliberate return, after an obvious exit had already presented itself, said something specific about her disposition. She did not leave things unfinished. Additional battery arrests in 1991, an attempt to run over a former employee in May 1992, and subsequent charges through 1998 for grand theft, aggravated assault, firearms possession, and cocaine trafficking built an arrest record that, viewed in sequence, traced a person who was testing what she could do and discovering, year by year, that the limits were wider than most people assumed. Each of those arrests also demonstrated something else, that the criminal justice system, as it encountered her repeatedly through the late 1980s and into the 1990s, was not producing a deterrent effect that changed her behavior. The charges accumulated, the behavior continued and expanded. What the arrest record shows in retrospect is not a history of escalation toward the drug trade. It is evidence that she was already embedded in it by the mid-1980s while simultaneously continuing to engage in the kind of direct personal violence that most drug organization leaders delegated entirely to their enforcers. She was not someone who had separated herself from the street to manage from a distance. She remained in it, physically and operationally, throughout the organization's entire existence. Entry, takeover, and the machine. She built. The connection that gave Avonda her first real foothold in Miami's drug trade was a dealer named Bunky Brown, one of the more established figures in the city's cocaine supply network by the early 1980s. Brown was not a kingpin in the sense that his operation had regional reach, but within Miami's distribution ecosystem, he was a recognized and active player, someone with supplier relationships, an operational structure, and a street-level workforce. Avonda's relationship with him gave her direct access to all of that from the inside. She was not observing the operation from a distance. She was participating in it, learning its mechanics, meeting the people who made it run, and developing the organizational knowledge that would later allow her to replicate the structure on her own terms. Brown later confirmed, in a May 1998 prison interview at the Atlanta Federal Penitentiary, that Avonda had been buying drugs directly from him while he was still active. That detail mattered for what happened next. When Brown was eventually imprisoned, Avonda's transition from buyer and associate to the person running his operation was not an improvised takeover. It was a continuity play, executed by someone who already had the supplier relationships and the workforce recognition that a hostile takeover would have required months to rebuild. The operation kept running. The people in it had a clear center of gravity. That center was now Avonda. In 1992, she married Jerry Jackson, a longshoreman who was operating his own cocaine distribution business in Overtown alongside his legitimate port employment. The couple had 2 children before divorcing in October 1992. The same year Jackson was in prison on drug-related charges. His incarceration produced the same result as Brown's. Jackson's Overtown operation transferred to Avonda, who absorbed it alongside what she had taken from Brown and folded both into a unified organization that, from 1992 forward, operated under her direct control. 2 separate drug businesses had become one. The workforce was larger, the territory was expanded, and the cash flow, already substantial, had increased in proportion. The Vonda gang, in its fully consolidated form, was now operating. The physical center of that operation was a drug spot at 11th Terrace and 2nd Avenue Northwest in Overtown, maintained continuously from 1985 to 1999. 14 years at the same location is a number that requires some unpacking. Street-level drug distribution operations typically cycle through disruption, relocation, and reorganization within months. They are terminated by arrests, by rival violence, by loss of supply, or simply by the exposure that comes with staying in one place long enough for law enforcement to build a case. The fact that the 11th Terrace hole ran for 14 consecutive years means that the structure built around it was specifically designed to absorb external pressure without collapsing, and that it had been tested by that pressure repeatedly across multiple law enforcement actions and years of gang warfare and had held. The hole occupied several apartments within a single building, with each apartment dedicated to a distinct function, one for storage, one for packaging, one for transactions. That physical separation meant that a police action against the sales apartment did not automatically expose the storage or preparation functions. Workers at each stage had limited visibility into the others, which reduced what any individual arrest could produce in the form of usable testimony. Federal prosecutor David Garday, who would try the case years later, used language in his courtroom description of the hole that was precisely chosen. Avonda's drug spot was the Walgreens of cocaine. It was the Eckerd of crack cocaine. The defendants operated their drugstore 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, preparing the packages of crack and cocaine powder they sold. The comparison to chain pharmacies was not rhetorical, it was structural. The hole served 2 distinct customer streams simultaneously: retail users buying for personal consumption and wholesale dealers who used the spot as their primary supply source and then distributed the product through their own separate networks. Managing both streams at the same time required a level of inventory discipline, pricing consistency, and staffing coordination that most competing operations in Miami's drug trade had not developed. Most holes operated as retail-only spots. Avonda's served the mid-level distribution tier as well, which embedded the organization into a larger supply chain and generated wholesale revenue on top of its retail income. The practical consequence was that the hole's customer base had structurally different needs. Retail customers arrived in high volume throughout the day and required fast-moving street-level service, while wholesale customers expected reliable large quantity availability because they were building their own downstream businesses around the assumption that 11th Terrace would have product ready when they needed it. 14 consecutive years of uninterrupted operation was what made that reliability credible, and credibility at that level became a form of competitive lock-in. Mid-level dealers who had organized their supply chains around the Vonda gang's hole had, over time, built business models that were structurally resistant to switching, because switching meant rebuilding the logistical assumptions their operations depended on. The technical capacity that allowed production to scale came in 1994. A Haitian contact named Tony taught Avonda how to convert powdered cocaine into crack. She practiced the conversion repeatedly, working in the kitchens of various apartments she rented, until she could execute it consistently and at quantity. The economic significance of that knowledge in Miami in 1994 was considerable. The spread between the wholesale price of powdered cocaine and the street price of crack cocaine was substantial, and an organization that could perform the conversion internally captured that margin directly rather than paying it to an intermediary. Jamal Brown confirmed in his December 2003 testimony to investigators that Tony had taught her the process, and that through repeated experimentation, she mastered cooking crack on the stoves in various apartments she rented. By the time the process became broadly understood across Miami's drug trade, she had already spent years producing at that level and had built a customer base and distribution infrastructure that could not simply be replicated by a newer entrant who had just learned to cook. The advantage was already baked into the organization's market position. The mastery of crack production also gave Avonda a form of technical authority over her own workforce that was unusual in that environment. She was not dependent on anyone else within the organization to perform the most critical conversion step in her supply chain. She understood it completely, could execute it herself, and could therefore identify when a worker was performing it incorrectly, producing substandard product, or skimming from the production process. That technical knowledge closed a vulnerability that most drug organization leaders carried: the dependency on a specialized worker whose expertise gave them leverage over the organization. Avonda had eliminated that leverage by acquiring the expertise herself. How the Vonda gang actually worked at any given time: the Vonda gang operated with a workforce of between 10 and 12 street-level employees, plus the core lieutenants who managed functions above that level. The structure was hierarchical and clear enough that each person within it understood their role, their compensation, and the consequences of failing to perform. That clarity was not accidental. It reflected Avonda's approach to management, which prioritized defined accountability over informal arrangement, because informal arrangements produce ambiguity, and ambiguity in a drug organization creates the conditions for theft, betrayal, and operational failure. The consequences of failure within the organization were not abstract. They were demonstrated specifically and publicly enough that everyone who worked for Avonda had a clear understanding of where the limits were and what crossing them produced. Workers who stole from the operation, talked to police, or became operationally unreliable were not simply fired. They were dealt with in ways that made the cost of those choices visible to everyone around them. That visibility was the mechanism by which the organization's internal discipline was maintained across 14 years and multiple generations of street-level employees. Loyalty was not demanded through loyalty alone. It was enforced through the consistent demonstration that the alternative to loyalty was something specific, known, and serious. The organization's record of violence, visible within the community it operated in, was not separate from its management structure. It was part of it. The workforce was demographically unusual for the Miami drug trade. She employed a significant number of women across the operation, a deliberate hiring choice that expanded her labor pool and, practically speaking, drew less automatic law enforcement scrutiny than an operation staffed entirely by men in a neighborhood that police were already monitoring closely. Women moving through residential blocks with packages attracted less attention than men doing the same thing. The practical advantage compounded the organizational one. She had access to a workforce segment that most of her competition was ignoring entirely. She paid them the same rates she paid anyone else who performed the same function, which ensured that the financial incentive for working within the organization, rather than for a competitor who might pay more, was consistent across the workforce. On a productive day, a worker could earn between $15,000 and $20,000. That figure was not incidental. It was calibrated to make the cost of defection or disloyalty genuinely prohibitive, because what you lost when you lost the job was income at a level that the legitimate economy in Overtown could not replace. Weapons acquisition was handled through a barter system that kept transactions off conventional financial records. AK-47s and MAC-10s came into the organization in exchange for cocaine rather than cash. The logic was straightforward. Cocaine was something the organization had in abundance and could replenish. Cash purchases of weapons created documentation. Barter created none. The result was a well-armed operation that had accumulated military-grade hardware without producing the paper trail that investigators would typically use to map an organization's weapons acquisitions. Avonda herself was not remote from the physical operations of the gang. She supervised the gunmen who protected the whole. She personally delivered product to her largest wholesale customers, sometimes arriving on a 10-speed bicycle, a choice that was operationally deliberate. A bicycle was unremarkable on a residential block. It was harder to track than a vehicle. It produced no registration record. For someone delivering product to wholesale accounts in Miami's residential neighborhoods, it was a more practical choice than it might appear. The three men who formed the gang's enforcement corps were structurally essential to how the organization defended itself. Robert Lee Sawyer, Rah Rah, had known Avonda since the early 1980s, before the crack era had reshaped Miami's drug economy. He had bought from her during that period, served multiple incarcerations, and returned each time as both a buyer and eventually as her primary enforcer. His role was to neutralize threats to the operation that could not be resolved by any other means, and he had a well-established history of doing so effectively. Jamal Brown joined the gang in the summer of 1993 when he was 16 years old, beginning as a street-level dealer earning approximately $1,000 per week and gradually being given more substantial responsibilities as Avonda moved him into her duplex on Northwest 50th Street and taught him personally to cook crack. Andre McWhorter, Bam, arrived in the 1990s and worked alongside Ra Ra as a co-enforcer, providing the additional firepower that operations of the Vonda gang scale required for territory protection. What the relationship between Avonda and Pukalata ultimately illustrated, across the arc of his involvement from 16-year-old recruit through his permanent paralysis after being shot in the neck following the Rogers killing, was how the organization calibrated loyalty and obligation. While he was functional and capable, he was compensated well, trained personally, and housed in her duplex. Once the Booby Boys' retaliatory shooting left him confined to a wheelchair and unable to work, that relationship ended. Avonda grew tired of taking care of him, berated him as if he were responsible for his own condition, and stopped providing for him. His value to the organization had been operational. When the operation was no longer something he could perform, the obligation ceased. That calculus, clear-eyed, transactional, and indifferent to the human cost, defined the internal culture of the Vonda gang as thoroughly as the compensation structure that attracted people into it in the first place. The clearest illustration of how the organization resolved competitive threats came in 1986, years before the gang war with the Booby Boys, when the Vonda gang was still in the process of establishing the dominance it would later sustain. A dealer named Michael McBride had set up a competing drug operation on 11th Terrace, adjacent to Avonda's hole. McBride was not positioning himself subtly. He was undercutting her prices and, more critically, offering a higher quality product. Both of those factors operating simultaneously meant that her customers had a rational alternative that was cheaper and better. She could not compete on price without compressing her margins. She could not compete on quality without renegotiating her supply chain, which would take time she did not have if McBride continued operating. The decision she made instead was to remove him. Ra Ra was hired to kill McBride for $10,000 in cash and half a kilogram of cocaine. On the night of April 22, 1986, McBride was on the balcony of his apartment on 11th Terrace. Ra Ra shot him once. McBride died. His operation closed. The hole at 11th Terrace continued without disruption, and its only remaining competition in that immediate geography was gone. The cost to Avonda, $10,000 and half a kilo, was measurably less than the lost revenue McBride would have claimed over the months required to compete him out of the market through pricing or quality adjustments. As Prosecutor Garday would frame it years later in a federal courtroom, in the cocaine trade on 11th Terrace, competitors were not outperformed, they were murdered. The McBride killing established a precedent for how every subsequent competitive threat to the organization would be handled, not through market adjustment, but through elimination. That model held for the next 11 years. The war that consumed Miami. By 1993, the organizational logic that had governed the Vonda gang for 8 years, remove competitors, protect territory, maintain continuous operation, collided with an organization that could not simply be removed. The Booby Boys were not a neighborhood crew. They were a structured criminal enterprise with geographic reach that extended far beyond Miami's borders and a capacity for violence that had already reshaped the city's street landscape before the two gangs came into open conflict. Kenneth Booby Williams had been building his operation since the late 1980s. By the time the war began, the Booby Boys were running an estimated $80 million cocaine empire that moved product through the Bahamas and Panama and into 12 states across the country. They were not a distribution network contained within Miami. They were a national operation headquartered there, with the resources and the organizational depth to sustain extended conflict. They were also responsible by Metro-Dade Police Department records for more than 35 murders and involvement in over 100 killings across an 8-year period, and they operated with an explicit strategy of using AK-47 assault rifles in drive-by shootings specifically designed to eliminate competition. Retired Detective Tony Monheim characterized the Booby Boys' presence in Miami as a terror wave, language that was specific and accurate rather than hyperbolic, because what the gang produced in Miami's streets for the better part of a decade was a sustained, targeted and geographically concentrated campaign of lethal violence. What is frequently absent from accounts of the gang war between the Booby Boys and the Vonda gang is the degree to which Avonda's organization functioned not as a victim of Booby Boys' aggression, but as an active aggressor in its own right. On her direct orders, Ra, Bam, and other members of the gang drove through Miami looking for Booby Boys members to kill. The war was prosecuted offensively from the Vonda gang's side, not as a defensive response to territorial pressure, but as the same competitive logic that had produced the McBride killing in 1986, now applied at a larger scale and against a far more capable opponent. The Vonda gang was geographically more concentrated than the Booby Boys, rooted primarily in Overtown, but within that geography, it had the infrastructure, the weapons, and the organizational cohesion to engage the Booby Boys across 5 years without collapsing. The war's most intense personal thread was the feud between Ra Sawyer and Marvin Rogers. The conflict escalated into something personal after the Booby Boys killed Wallace Fortner, a close associate of Ra's, an act that transformed what had been organizational rivalry into a direct vendetta. From that point, both men were primarily focused on the same objective, killing the other, and both proved extraordinarily resistant to each attempt. Rogers and an associate named Fat Wayne ran up to Ra's rented Lincoln at 590 Northwest 5th Street with rifles as he was backing out of a driveway. Ra accelerated before they could get into position and pulled away without being struck. Weeks later, Rogers found him again near 95th and 26th Street, pulling up behind Ra's rental truck in a Honda Accord at speed, with 2 associates and an AK-47. Multiple rounds struck Ra's vehicle. He kept driving. In September 1997, he was shot while traveling northbound on I-95 and hospitalized. Even then, the threat did not pause. His wife spotted 2 Booby Boys associates in the hospital elevator, overheard them discussing whether to finish the job in the building. Ra survived the hospital stay and resumed looking for Rogers. The cumulative civilian cost of 5 years of that conflict was documented in specific numbers that cannot be made abstract. Over the period from 1993 to 1998, at least 62 people were killed and another 36 were wounded across Miami as a direct result of the gang war between the 2 organizations. Combatants wore ski masks, camouflage clothing, and body armor and used AK-47s as their primary weapons. Some victims were struck by as many as 99 bullet holes, their faces destroyed beyond recognition. The neighborhoods in which this was happening, Overtown and the areas immediately surrounding it, were residential communities. People were trying to go to work, send children to school, and move through the ordinary logistics of daily life in an environment that had been converted by the decisions of 2 drug organizations into something they could not safely navigate. What the body count obscured was the secondary effect of sustained open-air warfare on a community already living under the conditions produced by decades of disinvestment and structural poverty. The fear that the gang war generated in Overtown was not limited to people with any connection to either organization. It was distributed across the entire residential population because the violence defining the conflict was not surgical. It was conducted with AK-47s and drive-by shootings that produced unintended casualties and created an atmosphere of indiscriminate threat. Residents with no involvement in the drug trade, no relationship with either gang, and no means of relocating out of the conflict's geography were nonetheless living inside it every day. Retired Detective Jeff Lewis described the effect on those residents directly. They became prisoners in their own neighborhoods, afraid to leave their homes because they could not predict where or when the next exchange of gunfire would occur. The war's end came from outside both organizations, and it came for the Booby Boys first. The U.S. Marshals located Kenneth Williams on May 17, 1999, leaving an apartment in a green Ford pickup, alone and unarmed, operating under an assumed name. There was no standoff. Williams confirmed his identity and was taken into custody without confrontation. More than 25 Booby Boys members were arrested in the broader sweep that followed. Williams, suspected in at least 15 murders, received a life sentence in federal prison. The organization that had generated $80 million and killed more than 35 people across 8 years was dismantled in a matter of months. What the federal investigators had not fully anticipated was the secondary consequence of that dismantlement. With the Booby Boys gone and their territory undefended, Avonda had moved quietly into the vacuum they left behind. The war had cost her organization significantly in personnel and exposure. It had cost her opponents their entire existence. She was still operating, Her hole was still open on 11th Terrace, and the federal government now had to build a case against a woman who had survived 15 years in that environment without ever producing enough evidence for prosecutors to act until the war itself had finally forced the issue into the open. The case, the sentence, and what remained building the federal case against Avonda Dowling took time that the available resources and the organizational complexity of the target made genuinely difficult to compress. The Vonda gang had operated for 15 years in an environment where cooperation with law enforcement was understood within the community as something that carried its own consequences, and where the internal structure of the organization had been deliberately designed to limit the exposure of any individual arrest could generate. The case required years of surveillance, informant development, and the careful accumulation of testimony from former associates whose own legal vulnerability had eventually reached a point where loyalty to the organization could no longer override the cost of continued silence. On November 14, 2002, a federal grand jury returned an indictment against Avonda Dowling and 4 co-defendants, charging a conspiracy to distribute at least 5 kilograms of cocaine between 1984 and sometime in 1989. The date window of the conspiracy charge was deliberately bounded. Prosecutors had chosen the period for which the evidence was legally strongest, not the full span of the organization's documented activity, which extended across a much broader timeline and encompassed far more than what the indictment named. That narrowing was a prosecutorial decision about where the case was most airtight, not a reflection of what investigators believed about the full scope of what had happened on 11th Terrace. Before the trial began, 2 of the organization's most critical members had already entered guilty pleas. Ra Sawyer had agreed to testify against Avonda as part of his cooperation agreement. He was ultimately not placed on the stand at trial. The reasons for that decision were not made public, but his prior grand jury testimony and the information he had provided during the investigation were already embedded in the case. He received 40 years on his plea bargain. Pukalata Brown, who had been confined to a wheelchair since the morning after the New Year's Eve killing, received a 25-year sentence, a period that would consume the remainder of his functional life. Andre McWhorter, the 3rd man in the vehicle on New Year's Eve, was acquitted of all charges against him. The jury found the government had not proven its case beyond the required threshold on the charges he faced. Avonda's defense at the 6-week trial rested primarily on a claim of temporal withdrawal. She acknowledged involvement in drug dealing prior to a certain point, but testified that she had completely exited the conspiracy by the end of 1995. The government dismantled that claim through the structural evidence of the operation itself. The 14 continuous years the hole at 11th Terrace had operated, the phone records placing her in direct communication with Ra immediately after the New Year's Eve killing, the financial transactions between her and her lieutenants, and the testimony of cooperating witnesses who placed her at the center of decisions that could not be explained by someone who had genuinely withdrawn from the enterprise years earlier. Gardet's courtroom description of the drug spot as a 24-hour retail and wholesale operation functioning like a chain pharmacy was not metaphor. It was the framework of a case built from documented organizational continuity, and the defense had no comparable counter-narrative to offer. The jury convicted her on the narcotics conspiracy charge. Before sentencing, a threshold decision had to be made at the highest level of the federal government. The U.S. Department of Justice formally evaluated whether to seek the death penalty for Avonda Dowling. The evaluation went to Attorney General John Ashcroft, who kept the decision open for months before ultimately concluding that the evidentiary standard required for a capital punishment ruling had not been met. The government knew what it believed about the full scope of the killings connected to Avonda and her organization. The gap between what it believed and what it could prove at the legal threshold required for a death sentence was the space that determined her outcome. She was sentenced to 20 years in federal prison. Given that the alternative had been execution, 20 years was a sentence that reflected the limits of what the evidence could support, not the limits of what investigators understood about what she had done. The money was never found. The Vonda gang had run a 24-hour drug distribution operation for 14 consecutive years, serving both retail and wholesale customers, with a workforce capable of generating between $15,000 and $20,000 per worker on a productive day. The cumulative revenue across that period, conservatively estimated, ran into the tens of millions of dollars. Federal investigators pursued the proceeds through every available tool: financial records, asset searches, surveillance of known associates, examination of property holdings, and recovered nothing that reflected the scale of what the operation had generated. Booby Williams had buried his money in cash. Avonda had hidden hers in Tupperware. Neither cash was ever located. The government dismantled the organization, imprisoned its principals, and left its accumulated wealth entirely unaccounted for. From inside federal prison, Avonda remained connected to the Overtown community in ways that received almost no coverage at the time of her trial. She organized donation drives and events for neighborhood residents, particularly women and young girls. While incarcerated, a dimension of her story documented in a Miami documentary and referenced by people who had known her from the neighborhood. Her son, who played college football at Florida A and M University and later worked toward a roster spot with the Philadelphia Eagles, publicly advocated for her release throughout her sentence. She was released from federal prison around 2020, consistent with the timeline of her 2003 sentencing and 20-year term. She is alive and has not appeared in any public record since her release. What she left behind in Overtown is not contained in any single document. The 62 people killed during 5 years of gang war represent only the deaths connected to that specific conflict. They do not account for the killings carried out to protect the whole across the full 14 years of its operation, or the deaths that occurred in the broader drug ecosystem the Vonda gang sustained across more than a decade. 36 more people were permanently injured during the war years. Pukalata Brown, who was 16 when Avonda recruited him and 20 when the Booby Boys put him in a wheelchair, spent the rest of his life immobile. And Avonda, by the account of investigators who looked into the relationship, stopped caring for him once his disability made him operationally useless to the organization. The Overtown residents who could not safely leave their homes during the height of the conflict were not collateral damage in a story about someone else. They were the immediate community within which the operation ran, and the harm to them was direct, sustained, and deliberate. Jeff Lewis, the retired homicide detective who had spent years building the Booby Boys case before turning his attention to Avonda, reached a conclusion he stated without qualification. When investigators asked informants about Blackgirl, the fear they encountered was not the abstract fear of reputation. It was produced by a specific history of documented actions, what she had done to competitors, to employees who had failed her, to rivals who had underestimated her, that people inside that world understood in precise detail. She had built something that lasted 15 years in one of the most dangerous drug markets in the country. She had fought the Booby Boys to a draw across 5 years and expanded after they fell. She had hidden every dollar the organization generated so effectively that the full resources of a federal investigation could not recover a cent. And she had done all of this in a world that had no institutional expectation that a woman could lead it, which meant that every tool, every alliance, and every protection that the men around her could take for granted had not been available to her. She had built it anyway, and she had built it to last. The cost of what she built, measured in the lives of the people in the neighborhood around her, is the full weight of the story. Both things are true. Neither one cancels the other out.